So let's talk about Texas. And specifically, let's talk about the history of Texas and how, in many ways, it anticipates what the Civil War is really all about. Texas was originally part of Mexico, hence the reason that some people still refer to it, right? It's Mexico. It was Mexican territory at first. But Mexico had a hard time getting people to move out of central Mexico, where the vast majority of Mexican people lived, in the Valley of Mexico and Mexico City and the immediate environs. Texas was thousands of miles to the north. It's very far away. It was inhabited by what they considered wild Indians, right? Indios barbaros. That's how they referred to them. And they hoped that Mexicans would eventually one day move to Texas and settle it, so that they could at least be defense against the Native Americans who lived there, who sometimes raided as far deep into Mexico as the state of Coahuila, and once even reached San Luis Potosí. But Mexicans never wanted to really move to Texas, right? It was too far away from the Central Valley of Mexico, and it had a bad reputation as a lawless place where the only inhabitants were what they referred to as savage Indians. So what ends up happening is that Americans, who we saw last week, had already been flooding into the deep south and into Louisiana and buying up prime cotton lands. Short staple cotton could be planted and grown in Texas profitably. So what ends up happening is that even when Texas still belongs to Mexico, Americans start moving into Texas in the 1820s, when land only cost 10 cents an acre, as opposed to $1.25 an acre in the United States for inferior land. Induced to move to Texas by the cheap prices and the ability to grow cotton in Texas, many Americans came. Of course, Stephen Austin was the most famous early American to arrive in what is today Texas. And he brought the famous 300 first families with him, who were all Anglos, who also brought enslaved African-descended people with them. By 1827, while Texas was still part of Mexico, there were 12,000 Anglo-Americans living there. In 1835, the population reached 30,000, of whom only 7,800 were Mexicans. That being said, in the western part of what is today Texas, you would find the Comanche Empire, a very strong indigenous empire of Native American people. And they probably constituted something like 40,000 people. So they did, in fact, outnumber the Anglo-Saxons who lived there. But the Anglo-Saxons who had moved into Texas hoping to grow cotton there had a strange, uneasy, not truce exactly with the Comanches, but the truth of it is they stayed out of the way. Right? Comanches were actually much more interested in raiding Mexicans anyways, whom they had been raiding for many decades already. In any case, trouble began brewing between these American transplants who had voluntarily repatriated themselves in Texas in 1829. And the reason is that many of these original settlers who came to Texas brought enslaved Africans with them when they came. In 1829, Mexico emancipated slavery. They ended slavery. They were not the first Latin American country to do so, but after Latin American countries won their independence from Spain, culminating ultimately in 1821 in the final battles in Peru, most of these Latin American countries adopted a republican form of government. And unlike the United States, in adopting a republican form of government where supposedly all citizens had equal political rights, at least male citizens had equal political rights, what happens is that Mexicans began abolishing racial caste and ending slavery as well. And that's in all Latin American countries. By the 1850s, even the last vestiges of slavery in Latin American countries, except for Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. In any case, in 1829, Vicente Guerrero, the president of Mexico, outlawed slavery explicitly in the entire country of Mexico. Now, Texas, which was still part of Mexico, imagine how all those Texans who had moved there and voluntarily became Mexicans but brought their slaves with them to grow cotton, imagine how they felt now that Mexico was officially a slave-free country. This was not something that made them very happy. Nevertheless, an exception was made for Texas. The Texans were allowed to keep the enslaved people that they had brought with them from the American southern states, Louisiana and the others, they were allowed to keep them as what they called debt peons. This was a form of servitude which was recognized under Mexican law. Ultimately, the Americans reclassified the enslaved people they brought with them as debt peons, but debt peons who were going to serve 99 years before they finished their term of labor. What that means is they still had slaves, despite the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. But it's really political events in Mexico that are going to trigger the revolt. And this is interesting because there's a lot of similarities between what happens in Texas and what's going to happen in the Civil War. In Mexico, a very centralist leader who believed in very strong federal power of the government became president. His name was Santa Anna. In fact, it was not his first term as the president. But in 1830, when he became president, he started to centralize and empower the federal government. Santa Anna, ultimately, there was a brief period where Mexico switches back to liberalism, but then he rides back into Mexico City, recaptures the country, and once again turns it into a conservative country where power was centered in the federal government. In the United States, federal government is centered in the national capital, Washington, D.C. In Mexico, federal government power is centered in the federal capital, El Distrito Federal, Mexico City, right? And Santa Anna was the president, and he annuls the Constitution of 1824, and instead he puts in place what he calls the Siete Leyes, what is this, the 7 laws in Spanish. And these 7 laws, they did away with state governments, turned the officer of government into one that would be appointed by Santa Anna himself, and it turned the states into military departments ruled over by the federal government. Texas, and actually other northern Mexican states, particularly Zacatecas, buckled under the authoritarianism which was being engendered by Santa Anna, the new president. There's rebellions against centralism nationwide. In Zacatecas, when they find that their militia has been disbanded in favor of the federal army, they rebel and are crushed by Santa Anna. Guerrero and Yucatan, likewise chafing under centralist control, there were rebellions there as well. Mexico City demanded that these states submit themselves to the federal government, and it was an attempt at nationalizing through the institution of the federal army. But in Mexico, the federal army was a wreck. It was top-heavy with soldiers. Becoming an officer in the Mexican army, that was one of the few paths to social advancement in that country. And a lot of the soldiers tended to be drafted beggars, prisoners, vagrants, right? In a lot of ways, actually, the military in Mexico mirrored the military in the United States. The federal military in the United States, not the militias, but that federal army was often made up of people who really had no other chance to survive and to earn food for themselves and to join the army. That was much the same in Mexico. In Zacatecas, they had a large militia, which was volunteer citizen soldiers, the kind of soldiers that American valorized ever since the American Revolution, and they rebelled against this new centralized government of Santa Anna, but they were crushed. Texas is also going to rebel. In 1830, this newly empowered Mexican government prohibited further American immigration into Texas. Texans held conventions all over the area demanding the repeal of the law of April 6, 1830, which prevented Anglos from immigrating into Texas, right? But all of the saber rattling on the part of the Texans ultimately results in an invasion from Santa Anna, the president of Mexico, actually still a very capable military leader, invades Texas. And Texans are scared, right? They are frightened that this is not going to work out well for them. And of course, the first major battle of this engagement from the Federal Army of Mexico against the Texans happens at the Alamo, right? Remember the Alamo. What happened was that Texans kind of split their forces. Some followed Sam Houston, who was a new general. He newly arrived in Texas from, I believe it was Tennessee. And he was going to retreat with the army, and Santa Anna was bringing a big army with him, right? You know, Santa Anna's army might have been disorganized and top-heavy with officers, but it was a powerful army, and the Texans were rightfully fearful of it. So one group of Texans decided they're going to hole up in this old mission, the Alamo, and what is today San Antonio. San Antonio de Bejar was how Mexicans referred to it. And Sam Houston would take the rest of the Texas army off to eastern Texas. Santa Anna entered San Antonio on February 23rd, 1835, with 2,500 troops and began a 13-day siege. March 2nd, in the nearby city of Gonzales, Texas declares its independence. Since Texas has now declared its independence, Santa Anna has no problem attacking these Texas rebels who are holed up in the Alamo. He has his horsemen sign the Deguello, a medieval battle cry that meant to the death, right? And hundreds were killed on both sides after a day-long siege at the Alamo. And ultimately, when the Americans were forced to surrender to the Mexican army, which was vastly superior to them, Santa Anna ordered that no prisoners be taken, and all were killed. The story is that one African-American enslaved person belonging to William Travis was allowed to escape to tell the tales of the cruelty of Santa Anna. So the Texan rebels, who revolted because they thought that the federal army, the federal government in Mexico had become too strong, who had revolted because they feared that ultimately the Mexicans would abolish slavery in Texas, they declared their independence, and they were brutally beaten by the Mexican army at the Alamo. A couple of weeks later, not too far from San Antonio, in the city of Goliad, Juan Almonte led another force, and they massacred the Texans who had holed up, the parts of the Texas army that had holed up in there. So Juan Almonte, unsure what to do, asked his superior, General Santa Anna, and General Santa Anna wrote back in no uncertain terms, "Kill them all." And as a result, Juan Almonte killed every last survivor from the Texas army at Goliad. As you can imagine, now the Texans had cause for revenge.